You're listening to The Unsafe Bible with Pastor Ken Brown.
I still wonder who the guy was that got North Korea, but that's different. But that hasn't changed. There are today these same fallen divine beings still overseeing the territories they were first assigned. They haven't moved. Some of them have gotten more powerful, some of them haven't. They're still fighting each other. That's why you have Shias and Sunnis, because two of these fallen guys don't get along, and they get others to do their warring for them. Occasionally you see it in the real world, and we'll see that in Daniel. He'll actually talk about it.
Are you ever amazed by the amount of division and evil in the world? Have you ever wondered how people like Adolf Hitler could commit such atrocities? Scripture tells us that it's not just the mind of man that is at work, but there are real divine spiritual beings that are influencing the world today. It's the same fallen beings that were influencing the world during the time of Daniel and the fall of Babylon. In today's message, Pastor Ken will show you that the power of Yahweh far outweighs the power of evil. Well, let's join Pastor Ken in the book of Daniel, chapter 5, as he begins his message, The Fall of Babylon.
We're talking about the fall of Babylon, and it's a story that we get a term, the handwriting is on the wall. Well, this is the story about the original handwriting on the wall, which is, once again, the supernatural world coming right into the physical world and getting right in the king's face. This is not King Nebuchadnezzar. This is a different king this time. But we'll cover at least the first half of it, the first 12 verses or so. So, backing up again, when we left chapter 4, we saw a man who was changed. Nebuchadnezzar was no longer the same. He was a different person. He wrote that chapter to let everybody know how God had changed his life and what God had done for him. It had changed. So imagine being in Babylon in the court or in the family of the king, and you're used to the king being one way. Then he's been acting like an animal for 7 years. He gets his wits back around him, and now he no longer goes to the parties that he used to go to. He no longer screams and yells like he used to. He doesn't have an anger management problem anymore. In fact, he worships Yahweh. And they don't know what happened to him. They can't figure out what happened to him. So his family members had to deal with this. The court had to deal with this. And what we're going to see in chapter 5 is some of the leavings of that, even 25 years after the fact. There were things still happening that were based on what happened in chapter 4. Because he no longer worshiped the local gods. And when you look at it the way that someone in that day and age would look at it, such as the king of Babylon, they all had their own local gods. And if they could beat the town next door, that meant their god was more powerful than that god. And they would take that god and put it inside their temple. Well, Nebuchadnezzar converted to a foreign god, one that he had defeated, because that God was actually the God of the universe and was more powerful than all of the gods he worshipped. He worshipped the God of a conquered people. That was not heard of, and that was not normal in that day and age. It just wasn't. So it was a little bit strange for him to do it. Based on the way they thought at the time, what he did was not politically expedient at all. In Deuteronomy chapter 32, verse 8 and 9, we see the worldview that most Jews had at this time. And we covered it when we talked about the unseen realm. It goes back to what happened in Genesis chapter 11. But it talks about the fact that when the Most High gave to the nations their inheritance, because of the rebellion at Babel, he divided mankind. God did. It says that in verse 8. He fixed the number of the borders of the people according to the numbers of the sons of God. So there's 70 nations outlined in chapter 10 of Genesis. He divided the world into 70 nations and assigned different divine beings to oversee that. Now, initially, they were in service to Yahweh, but many of them became corrupted and began to demand worship themselves. And that became a problem. But the Lord's portion is his people Jacob, his allotted heritage. So Israel belongs to the Lord. This section of Scripture is part of the Jewish worldview. They saw that the world belonged to all these other gods, these these fallen divine beings, little g, by the way, gods, whereas Israel belonged to Yahweh. But Israel blew it big time and actually started worshiping the gods they weren't supposed to worship. These individuals, these fallen divine beings who were actually created by Yahweh and were subservient to him. They started worshiping them and they fell as a result of what went on. But this is the worldview that they had. And some of the nations around Israel held that same worldview. This country had their God, this country's God was Baal, that country's God was Marduk. They had different ones. Then they started changing the names, and in fact, as you start tracing it, you find out that Jupiter used to be Baal, and he had multiple different names, but it's the same fallen divine being. And we're going to get into that as we go further into the book of Daniel, because we'll see that there are these princes that get reference to Daniel, and they're not human, they're divine. So we'll get to that too. But because of that worldview in Deuteronomy 32, the geography that we see in the Bible is also cosmic in terms of its perspective. The ground is either holy, meaning it's dedicated to Yahweh, so that's Israel, it's dedicated to Yahweh, or it is in the domain of another god. And you see that worldview reflected in different places in the Bible. In Daniel, we see the foreign nations being ruled by divine princes. When a kingdom would conquer another kingdom, their god was more powerful than the god of that nation they conquered. They'd take that god and put it inside their temple. That doesn't always work real well. In 1 Samuel chapter 5, the Philistines beat the nation of Israel in a battle, and they conquered the Ark of the Covenant. So what they did is they took the Ark of the Covenant and they put it inside the temple to their god, Dagon. Samuel chapter 5. The Philistines captured the Ark of God and brought it from Ebenezer to Ashdod. So they brought it down to the coast. And they took the Ark of God and brought it into the house of Dagon and set it up beside Dagon. So that's the normal thing that they would do. Our God is more powerful than your God. We just conquered you in battle. So we're going to put your God next to ours to show that he is now subservient to our God. Small problem. It's the Ark of the Covenant, the God of the universe. And when the people of Ashdod arose early the next day, behold, Dagon had fallen face downward on the ground before the Ark of the Lord. So they get up in the morning and they find Dagon in a worship position in front of the Ark of the Covenant. That's a problem. They figure somebody's playing a game. They set it back up. It's got to show exactly what this is. So they put him back in his place. But the next morning they get up, and again, Dagon's flat on his face in front of the Ark of the Covenant. Oh, and his head is now missing, and his hands have been broken. So it's not a good thing. Only the trunk of Dagon was left to him. So this is why it says, the priests of Dagon and all who enter the house of Dagon do not tread on the threshold of Dagon and Ashdod to this day. They believed, because that's where Yahweh, the Ark of the Covenant, shoved their God, that now belonged to Yahweh. So they would come into their temple, and they knew this right here belonged to Yahweh. Well, they didn't belong to Yahweh, they belonged to Dagon. So they would do this and walk around that area that belonged to Yahweh. That was their mindset at that time. So, David even reflected too in a couple of his Psalms when he was lamenting the fact that he was not in Israel, he was in another country, and he says, I don't want to worship these foreign gods. So, Nebuchadnezzar conquered Judah. He took all the people captive. They're not in that area anymore. So, this cosmic geography thing they've been dealing with is now kind of like, yeah, that might not work. But what did he do with the items from the temple? When he conquered Jerusalem, he put them in, stuck them inside a warehouse or something. It says it in 2 Chronicles 36:7 what he did. He carried off a portion of the implements from the house of the Lord to Babylon and placed them in his temple in Babylon. So they're either in the temple of the god or a warehouse. He has them placed in storage, but he's a smart enough king to know, yeah, I conquered these people. Yeah, they're here. Yeah, before he gave his life to Yahweh, yeah, my God's more powerful than there, but I'm still not going to do anything to commit sacrilege with any of those items because I don't want to blow it with these people I conquered. I want their hearts and minds. I want them to follow me. It's a reflection of the belief of the time that the God of the conquering nation was more powerful than the God of the nation that was conquered. So items from the conquered nation's temple would be placed in the temple of the conquering nation's God to show subservience to it. That's why they're there. So Nebuchadnezzar, he was smart. He was a smart despot. And he knew he needed to win the hearts and minds. And you don't do that by misusing the implements that you take. So he conquered Assyria. He didn't take the stuff from Dagon and misuse it. He just stuck it there, and there it was. Same thing with the temple of the Most High God. He put the implements inside there, and he didn't do anything with them. But now he's a king, and he's changed. And because of the advisors in a foreign god, that's what other people would say, okay? The king is no longer the same. The king now worships Yahweh. He doesn't worship Baal anymore. He doesn't worship El. He doesn't worship any of the gods we have on the main drag here in downtown Babylon. He's busy worshiping Yahweh, who's from 1,500 miles away. Can you imagine that? He's worshiping a God who's 1,500 miles away. They don't understand at that point that God is everywhere. He does. He understands that. But the political view of the rest of the court is, what happened to him? You know, as long as he lived, because he's Nebuchadnezzar, nobody would challenge him. Remember, he had a history of an anger management problem, and when he said, off with your head, he meant it. So nobody messed with him while he was alive. But we also see the idea of cosmic spiritual geography again, this idea that's in the scriptures that was kind of part of the worldview at that time period. The idea that certain divine beings have authority or rulership over certain specific kingdoms. And we're going to see that later in Daniel, where it's referred to, this is the prince of Greece and this is the prince of Persia. And he's not talking about earthly princes. He's talking about divine beings who are fallen, who are supposed to be serving God but aren't anymore. They're demanding worship. And they're actually preventing God's messengers from being able to do what they need to do. By the way, here's something else to remember about these fallen divine beings having authority over certain kingdoms, certain countries. We tend to think about that and read it when we study Daniel and say, yeah, that was 500 BC. That doesn't happen today. Wrong. That fallen divine being who had authority over Persia in 500 BC is still fruitier than a nut cake and is overseeing Iran today. And what does he want to do? He still wants to kill everybody. He hasn't changed his viewpoint. He's still crazy. I still wonder who the guy was that got North Korea, but that's different. But that hasn't changed. There are today these same fallen divine beings still overseeing the territories they were first assigned. They haven't moved. Some of them have gotten more powerful, some of them haven't. They're still fighting each other. That's why you have Shias and Sunnis, because two of these fallen guys don't get along, and they get others to do their warring for them. Occasionally you see it in the real world, and we'll see that in Daniel, and he'll actually talk about it. But remember the last words from King Nebuchadnezzar. These are his last words. I, King Nebuchadnezzar, to all the nations and all the territories and all those who dwell in them, peace to you, be multiplied in all times. And now I will show you the things that the great God has done with me. He's changed. He's talking about Yahweh. And it seems good to me to show you and your wise men that God exists and to show you his great wonders. His kingdom is a kingdom forever, his authority from generations to generations. And he sent letters about everything that happened to him in his rule to all the nations under his rule. What Israel was supposed to do and didn't, Nebuchadnezzar did on behalf of Yahweh. Figure that one out. With those words, by the way, and that testimony, we see the end of his reign. He's a believer. I really think we're going to see him in the kingdom. But from Daniel 1 to the events we're talking about in Daniel 5, 70 years have now gone by. Remember back in Daniel 1, these were teenagers, 13 years old? Daniel's not a teenager anymore. He's in his early 80s. He's been in forced retirement for a while. Or maybe not. We don't know. The Bible does not record what happened after Nebuchadnezzar died in 562 BC. We don't know. It doesn't talk about who his immediate successors were. We just know there's this guy named Belshazzar in chapter 5. And when it says extra-biblical literature is somewhat confused, when Dr. Walvoord wrote that back in the 80s, some of the research that had taken place today had not yet been completed. So now we have additional items and archaeological discoveries that tend to give us a little bit better sense of what actually took place. So what historians now tell us is that after Nebuchadnezzar died, all of the ministers who were the part of the palace regulars, because they were considered to be part of that group that saw him come to Yahweh, they were retired. They were sent to the farm, and new ones were brought in who would be faithful to the local gods. They didn't know who it was. They had some thoughts, but they couldn't do anything about it. Now, Daniel dropped out of sight, and he's been in obscurity for 10, 20 years. He hasn't shown up in anything. But there is a historian by the name of Berosus who gives us some information, and this is actually in the work of Flavius Josephus, who was a historian writing around 70 A.D., and Josephus had access to his books. So he tells us that Berosus actually provided a background, a history of who it was that ruled after Nebuchadnezzar. Based on other information we found, this is pretty accurate. So he talks about Nebuchadnezzar, after he had begun to build the aforementioned wall, fell sick and departed this life when he had reigned 43 years. Okay? Whereupon his son Evil-Merodach obtained the kingdom. And we know it was Evil-Merodach because he's actually referenced in the scriptures. He governed public affairs after an illegal and impure manner and had a plot laid against him by Nero-Glissor, his sister's husband, and was slain by him when he had only been king for 2 years. And after he was slain, Nero-Glissor, the person who plotted against him, succeeded him in the kingdom, and he reigned 4 years. Then his son obtained the kingdom, but he was still a child. He kept it 9 years, had a bad temper and bad practices, and he got put to death too. After that, the conspirators got together and by common consent put the crown on the head of Nabonidus, who was a Babylonian and one who belonged to that insurrection. And when you start looking at other historical sources, that's pretty accurate in terms of what it is. So Nebuchadnezzar has been gone for about 25 years now. Daniel's pushing 80, or is over 80. Nabonidus, who is the king, made his son Belshazzar co-regent, or the second ruler in the kingdom. That's important because there's later going to be an offer of whoever can tell me what this means will be the third ruler in the kingdom. That's why he says that, because Nabonidus had a problem. He worshiped the god Sin. Great name, right? This god was not a Babylonian god. It was a god that lived in Saudi Arabia. So he spent a lot of his time south in Saudi Arabia rebuilding altars that belonged to the god Sin. Today you know him by a different name, Allah. But anyway, that's what his name was then. And he was rebuilding all of his altars. Well, he wasn't home when these events take place in chapter 5. His son was ruler in his place. So he's the second ruler in the kingdom. Nabonidus had a history of not being there, especially at New Year's. And when it was customary for the king to participate in traditional rites, he wasn't there. He didn't want to take part in it because he didn't worship those gods. The absences were so frequent and long-lasting that his son is now in control. He was not exactly a really good king, especially when a guy by the name of Gubaru, here's a great name to be a commander, he's the commander of the Persian army, and he's working for a guy by the name of Cyrus, and he shows up outside the walls of Babylon and beats the Babylonians, and they all come back inside. So Belshazzar has already lost a battle to Gubaru. Now it says Belshazzar apparently died shortly after the conflict. Yeah, no, he was by the Persians. And Nabonidus was captured and then paroled. But Cyrus, 2 weeks after all of this, marched in the city and took over. And we'll find later that a guy by the name of Daniel meets Cyrus when he comes in and reveals to him something written in the book of Isaiah several hundred years before, where Cyrus is named by name by God. We'll cover that when we get to it. The Bible, though, doesn't reference anybody by the name of Nabonidus. It's not in the scriptures. But it's in the context of this section of scripture when we see the offer of the third ruler, okay? So it's Nabonidus, Belshazzar, and eventually Daniel. But it was real. You know, Belshazzar is the co-regent with his dad. He's the second. Now, we also know because of other discoveries, and this is the Nabonidus cylinder, there's actually on this a prayer for Nabonidus and his son Belshazzar. So we know that exists. And this is how they would write things. If they were going to send a letter out, they'd write it on a cylinder, and you could take a piece of wet clay and roll it on it, and then you'd be able to read it. So that was their messenger service at the time. But that's one of 4 cylinders that they found at a ziggurat south of Babylon in 1854. They only recently translated it. But there were 4 of them, one at each corner, and they all said the same thing. I guess it was, the blessing on the ziggurat or something, I don't know. But there was one on each one, because he rebuilt it between 555 and 539 BC, somewhere during that time period. Now, Babylon is a great big place, and I want to give you kind of an outline from Herodotus as to what it looked like at this time, so you can kind of get a sense of what's about to happen here in the text. So I'm looking at other historical sources. The Bible doesn't tell you much about how big the city is, but Herodotus does. He was there, and he gives us some background. Babylon was a city such as I now describe it. It lies in a great plain. It's in a shape of a square. Each side is 15 miles in length. This is in a time period where the average town was 10 acres. This is a big place. 60 miles make the complete circuit of the city. So if you rode the top of the walls, it was a 60-mile ride. Such is the size of the city of Babylon. And it was planned like no other city, which we know. Remember, that was one of the things that Nebuchadnezzar was good at. He was an architect. Around it runs a moat, deep and wide, full of water, and a wall 83 feet thick and 333 feet high. Okay? This is a big wall. They wanted to make sure nobody could get in. The royal measure is greater by 3 fingers' breadth than the common measure. So I must also relate where the earth was used as it was dug from the moat and how the wall was constructed. As they dug the moat, they made the bricks of the earth, which was carried out of the place they dug, and when they had molded bricks enough, they baked them in ovens. Ovens, right there near anyway. And using hot bitumen for cement, because they kept having this black pitch come up out of the ground all the time. That's why they have oil wells all over there now. But it was just coming up out of the ground. And they used it for cement, interposing layers of wattled reeds at every 30th course of bricks. And they built the first border of the moat and then the wall itself in the same fashion. On the top, along the edges of the wall, they built houses of a single room facing each other with space enough between to drive a 4-horse chariot. This is a big wall, okay? There are 100 gates in the circuit of the wall, all of bronze, with posts and lintels of the same. There's another city called Is. 8 days' journey from Babylon, where there's a little river also named Is. It's a tributary of the Euphrates River. From the source of this river, many lumps of bitumen rise with the water, and from there the bitumen was brought for the wall of Babylon. Thus, then, this wall was built. The city is divided into 2 parts, for it's cut in half by the Euphrates, a wide, deep, and swift river flowing from Armenia and issuing into the Red Sea. The angles of the wall then on either side are built quite down to the river, where they in turn, and from here, a fence of baked bricks runs along each bank of the stream. The city itself is full of houses 3 and 4 stories high. This is not a small town. And the ways that traverse it, those that run crossways towards the river, and the rest are all straight. Further at the end of each road, there is a gate in the riverside fence, 1 gate for each alley. These gates were also of bronze, and these 2 opened on the river. These walls are the city's outer armor. Within them is another encircling wall, nearly as strong as the other, but narrower, and in the middle, one division of the city stands, the royal palace, surrounded by a high and strong wall. That's by an eyewitness. Herodotus was actually there, and he saw it. So what he's describing is this. This is Babylon. This is the Babylon he's describing. It's a square. You see the river going through it. You see the moat going around it. You see the king's palace right in the center of it, right next to the ziggurat at Temenaki, which is sitting on the remains of another ziggurat that some guy named Nimrod built. But that's the town. That's what Babylon looked like, the one that was described by Herodotus.
Today's message was in the book of Daniel, an Old Testament prophecy book. Pastor Ken has been teaching about some great things from this book here on the Unsafe Bible. Imagine living most of your adult life in a foreign land. This was what God had for Daniel, but the way God used him was powerful. In the land of Babylon, Daniel witnessed many kingdoms come and go, rise to power and fall to others. But under several kings, Daniel found favor because he honored God along the way. Wouldn't you love to be known for honoring God all of your life? It wasn't an easy road for Daniel to take, but when he was faced with each trial or opposition, he put God as number one, and God blessed him and gave him high esteem. If you want to hear more about Daniel's life and journey through these things, you can listen to additional teachings at theunsafebible.com. While you're there, feel free to get a better understanding of what we believe and what our core foundation is built on by going to the About tab at theunsafebible.com. Do you live in the Jupiter, Florida area? If so, you're welcome to join us for these kinds of messages in person. You'll notice ways to contact us on our website, so you can find out when and where we meet each week. Go to theunsafebible.com and look for the Connect tab. We're so glad you took the time today to hear from God's Word. Pastor Ken has more to share with you from the book of Daniel, so don't miss a single edition. Continue growing on your own, and then come back for more on the Unsafe Bible.